You may not have thought about teapots today. Or perhaps you have, but only briefly, in that passing way people do, while wondering whether there's still enough milk in the fridge. Either way, this story isn't really about you, it's about teapots. Teapots who, on one particular afternoon, found themselves possessed of opinions. Not urgent ones. No teapot has ever been in a rush, but the sort of opinions that arrive as slowly as steam rising from a forgotten kettle. They were sitting in a row, as teapots tend to do, on a polished wooden shelf in a room that smelled faintly of bergamot and old upholstery. The afternoon light leaned through the lace curtains at such an angle that the pots' porcelain bellies gleamed just a little too proudly. Some wore floral patterns, dainty and slightly faded. Others were plain, utilitarian, the sort of pot you trust to brew a strong, no-nonsense cup. Together, they were very still, but stillness, as it turned out, was never the same as silence. The first opinion that day came from a rotund blue pot with a chipped spout. It sighed, in the way only teapots can sigh, a faint, hollow sound of air shifting in porcelain. "This afternoon feels," it announced gravely, "somewhat tepid." The teapots around it rustled with approval, if you can call the microscopic tremble of glazed clay a rustle. Tepid, after all, was a safe word. Non-committal. The sort of word no one could reasonably object to. Another teapot, slender and ivory, responded at last. "I should say mild. Tepid feels judgmental." The blue pot did not take offense. Teapots rarely do. Instead, it gave a dignified pause, which is the closest a teapot comes to a shrug. And just like that, an entire afternoon of commentary began to simmer. The shelf itself was wide enough to make them feel important, but narrow enough to keep them always aware of their precariousness. One over-enthusiastic opinion, one wobble too bold, and the consequences would be unceremoniously loud. Perhaps that was why their discussions remained so measured. The subject of time emerged next. Teapots had a peculiar way of sensing it, not by clocks, but by the warmth that passed through their handles and lids, by the hush of a room when no one entered for too long. "The hour," murmured a small earthenware pot, "is neither early nor late. It is precisely in the middle of nothing." No one disagreed. It seemed accurate, if not especially useful. And so, there they sat, having opinions about the afternoon itself, an afternoon that was not too hot, not too cool, not too much of anything. In short, it was exactly the sort of afternoon in which teapots would begin to talk. The conversations drifted, repeating themselves often, circling back to whether tepid or mild better suited the sunlight filtering through the curtains. The arguments contained no passion, no resolution, and no sense of urgency, which of course is what made them perfect. And as the shelf hummed faintly in the warmth of the day, one might have wondered, though only briefly, and only if one were already drifting into drowsy thoughts, whether it was the teapot shaping the afternoon, or the afternoon shaping the teapots. It didn't matter. They seemed content to let the question steep, like tea leaves left floating in the pot, flavoring nothing in particular, but lingering all the same. The afternoon continued, as afternoons insist on doing, though the teapots were under no impression that progress was being made. Teapots, unlike clocks, do not feel the need to tick. They sit, they hold, they wait. And occasionally, when the mood strikes, they comment. The floral pattern teapot, decorated with roses that had once been red but now resembled a polite pink blur, cleared its non-existent throat. "I find," it began in a voice no one else could hear but everyone somehow noticed, "that the sun is leaning too heavily on the lace curtain. It makes the room seem presumptuous." The plain brown teapot, solid and stout, rumbled back, "Presumptuous? It's light. Light doesn't presume. It just lands where it pleases." The floral teapot tilted its lid ever so slightly, as though attempting to look offended but failing. Meanwhile, the little chipped blue pot, still basking in its earlier contribution of tepid, felt emboldened. What is light, after all, but hot air with a costume? The brown pot harumphed, not in disagreement, but in admiration. It was, by teapot standards, a rather bold opinion. They turned their collective attention, as they so often did, to biscuits. Biscuits were the great common ground, the eternal subject of teapot philosophy. The floral teapot preferred them crisp, brittle enough to shatter dramatically over a saucer. The brown pot found such fussiness exhausting, preferring the sturdy dunking kind, the sort that could survive a full 5-second immersion without collapsing. For a time, this became the central debate. Not a heated one. Teapots do not heat themselves, but a gentle circling around the subject, with pauses long enough to suggest everyone had briefly forgotten the matter entirely. And then, like a half-remembered melody, biscuits would return again. If anyone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual: a neat shelf, a row of teapots, a quiet room with dust motes hanging in the sunlight. It is always this way with teapots. Their entire world takes place inside the kind of stillness most people overlook. And perhaps that is what makes them so convincing. After all, if an afternoon can stretch out without asking anything of you, perhaps it is not wasted but simply waiting. Just like the teapots. After the matter of biscuits drifted into the comfortable silence where all conversations eventually dissolve, the teapots began to notice the faint creak of the shelf beneath them. It was not alarming. Teapots rarely find anything alarming. But it was noticeable, in the way one notices a chair sighing under its sitter, or a floorboard complaining gently about footsteps. "This shelf," remarked the ivory pot, which always spoke as if auditioning for elegance, "is rather philosophical." "How so?" asked the stout brown teapot, more interested in practicality than philosophy. "It holds us," the ivory pot said simply, "but it never insists that we move, it simply supports." The chipped blue pot, eager to participate, added, "Like a saucer, but for teapots." There was a long pause, and then several of the others gave faint, hollow hums of approval. It was an agreeable metaphor, and teapots do love metaphors almost as much as they love biscuits. The floral patterned teapot, who still believed the sun to be presumptuous, took this moment to offer its own contribution. "The shelf gives us perspective. From here, I can see the whole room, the chair with the sagging cushion, the carpet with the corner that never quite lies flat, the curtain that seems to sigh when the window opens." The others hummed again. It was not a grand revelation, but teapots have never demanded grandeur. Observations, even small ones, were quite enough. A long silence followed. Dust drifted through the sunlight, soft and unbothered. The teapots sat perfectly still, not out of duty, but out of nature. Waiting was what they did best. And as the afternoon stretched itself across the floorboards, it seemed perfectly reasonable that nothing more should happen at all. For perhaps they thought, or at least gave the impression of thinking, An afternoon doesn't need to be full. Perhaps it only needs to be noticed, gently, by someone who has nowhere urgent to go, and nothing urgent to do. And if that someone happens to be a row of teapots, all the better. At some point, though no teapot could say exactly when, water arrived. Not in a sudden rush, but in the steady, careful pour that suggests a person had nothing more pressing to do. Hot water, as always, transformed the shelf from a place of idle opinions to a venue of active murmurs. The stout brown pot was the first to sigh. Steam drifted lazily from beneath its lid, curling upward like a thought that refused to form. "There is nothing quite like the sensation of being useful," it said, voice deepened by the echo of liquid sloshing inside. "One feels substantial." The ivory pot, filled more delicately, responded with a crisp little gurgle. "One mustn't confuse usefulness with importance," it remarked, sounding faintly smug. "A pot may be full, yet still remain entirely ordinary." The chipped blue pot gave a delighted hiss of steam. "Ordinary things," it said, "are the most reliable. Imagine a life full of surprises. Exhausting." The others hummed again, sending tiny ripples through the water within them. As the steam thickened, drifting through the afternoon light, it carried with it the beginnings of debate. Not a debate about milk or biscuits this time, but about steam itself. Was it elegant or wasteful? Did it dignify a teapot to send up curling wisps into the air? Or did it simply mean one had failed to keep a lid on things? The floral pattern teapot gave a long, dreamy sigh. "Steam is performance," it said, watching its own vapor dance upward. "It is a way of saying, look at me, I am more than a container. I am transformation itself." "Or evaporation," the brown pot grumbled. "Losing oneself into thin air is hardly something to boast about." There was no resolution, only murmurs that rose and fell in rhythm with the warmth that pulsed through their porcelain bodies. It was not the sort of argument that needed winning, only the sort that needed to exist, briefly, before dissolving like steam itself. And as the air of the room filled with a faint fog of heat and idle talk, the teapot seemed to embody the afternoon's pace perfectly. Slow, repetitive, pleasant enough to notice but not enough to remember, which, when one considers the matter, is exactly what most afternoons are for. The room had grown slightly warmer now, though only in that gentle, sluggish way that makes people wonder whether they should open a window and then decide against it. The teapots, of course, had no such dilemmas. Their warmth was not optional. It radiated from within, unavoidable and faintly proud. The chipped blue pot began humming softly, not a tune exactly, more like the faint rattle of water shifting against porcelain. "Steam," it murmured, "always seems to drift upward. I've never seen it fall." "Because it wants to rise," offered the ivory pot. "Because it has no choice," countered the stout brown pot. The floral pattern teapot, not to be left out, sighed again, its favorite form of contribution. "Perhaps it rises because afternoons are heavy, and something must balance them. If the hours sink, the steam must float." This was considered by the others in silence. Teapots were never quick to respond. Their discussions moved at the pace of steeping leaves, slow, gradual, and eventually too strong to ignore. Meanwhile, the steam continued its performance, curling upward, catching the slanting light, and disappearing into the vague region of the ceiling where no one ever looks. It seemed content to vanish without applause. The brown pot gave a little gurgle, the kind that suggests it was thinking too hard for its own good. "Do you suppose steam is us leaving, little bits of ourselves floating away?" The ivory pot sniffed, inasmuch as a teapot can sniff. Don't be sentimental. It's just water dressing up as air. But the chipped blue pot rather liked the idea. If steam is leaving, it said, then perhaps we are always giving ourselves to the room, sharing. That seems polite. Another silence followed, this one longer, gentler. It wasn't clear whether the teapots were pondering, or whether they had simply forgotten the question. Both possibilities suited them equally well. And as the steam curled on, thin and quiet, one might almost have thought the whole room was exhaling. An afternoon sigh stretched out into nothing in particular, the sort of sigh that needs no explanation. By now the air above the shelf resembled a faint, invisible conversation of its own. Wisps and curls of steam mingling together, rising lazily and vanishing as though they had better places to be. None of the teapots seemed offended by this disappearance. If anything, they took pride in it, as though every wisp of vapor were an essay published into the atmosphere, promptly unread by anyone at all. The floral patterned teapot tilted its lid. I do believe steam makes the room softer, as if the air itself has been wrapped in cloth. Or dampened, muttered the brown pot, which is to say, slightly stickier than it was before. The ivory pot, always chasing refinement, chimed in. Steam is the poetry of boiling. It doesn't need to be practical, it only needs to appear. The chipped blue pot gave a happy little burble. Then we are poets, all of us, accidental ones. This suggestion pleased them all. Not because it was profound, but because it was pleasantly unprovable. And nothing delights a teapot more than a conclusion no one can disagree with. Mostly because it has no consequence whatsoever. As the conversation dwindled, their murmurs slowed to a rhythm that matched the gentle cooling of the water inside them. Steam thinned, rising less eagerly now, retreating as if to remind them that performance can never last forever. The room settled back into its quietness, as though the entire event had been nothing more than a slight ripple in an otherwise still pond. And in a way, it was. Teapots never really change. They only fill, pour, empty, and wait. But on this particular afternoon, it seemed enough to notice that steam had come and gone, leaving nothing behind, except the faintest suggestion that the air had been thinking. Or at least pretending to. It was inevitable, of course. No matter how far their opinions strayed, whether into steam, shelves, or the philosophical weight of afternoons, they always circled back to biscuits. Teapots without biscuits are like clouds without rain, possible, but faintly disappointing. The stout brown pot began the conversation in its usual practical tone. A biscuit should be absorbent. That is the point. It should accept tea the way a sponge accepts water. The ivory pot made a delicate clink of disapproval. Absorbent, yes, but not surrendering. A biscuit should maintain dignity when dunked. The floral patterned pot, gazing dreamily at the lace curtain, gave a sigh. I prefer a biscuit that crumbles dramatically, something that collapses into sweet ruins after the very first touch. Wasteful, grumbled the brown pot. Nothing worse than fishing for crumbs. The chipped blue pot, enjoying its new role as philosopher, added, perhaps biscuits are metaphors. Some crumble, some endure. Some are dry and plain, others are sugar-dusted with ambition. And yet, all end the same, eaten. There was a long pause as the teapots considered this. Teapots adore metaphors, even when they don't understand them. Especially when they don't understand them. The floral patterned pot sighed again. Still, a biscuit is a companion. Without one, tea is only half a story. and the others hummed in quiet agreement, for this was a truth they could all settle into, like leaves at the bottom of a pot. The biscuit debate deepened, though not in any useful sense of the word. Teapots rarely resolve anything, they simply let ideas steep until they are too cool to matter. The stout brown pot insisted, the ideal biscuit is plain, a square perhaps, it knows its purpose, it does not distract. The ivory pot clinked in protest. A square is not elegance. A biscuit should hint at refinement, a scalloped edge perhaps, a glaze. Something to remind the eater that civilization exists. Civilization, the brown pot muttered, crumbs everywhere. The chipped blue pot, encouraged by its earlier philosophical remark, tried again. Every biscuit ends in dissolution, one way or another, either by dunking or by teeth. Why argue over shapes when destiny is so certain? The floral pattern teapot sighed, a sound somewhere between resignation and contentment, because the shape is the only thing we can admire before it vanishes. Surely that is worth something. This idea pleased the ivory pot immensely. The brown pot considered it for a moment, then chose not to respond, which in teapot terms was a concession. From the corner of the shelf a rarely used metal teapot, dull and slightly dented, finally spoke up. Its voice was raspy, as though unused to opinion. I once heard of a biscuit shaped like a moon. The others turned their silent attention toward it, surprised not by the claim, but by the fact that it had spoken at all. The floral patterned pot gasped faintly, its lid rattling just a touch. A moon-shaped biscuit. How unnecessary. How delightful. The steam had thinned by now, the earlier murmur fading into occasional drifts. Still the conversation pressed on, circling around moons, squares, scallops, and whether biscuits should be admired before they are eaten, or precisely because they will be. And in the slow rhythm of their chatter, it became clear, biscuits were not just food to them. They were a philosophy, endlessly crumbled and endlessly reassembled in words. The biscuit debate lingered, as all teapot discussions do, circling round and round until the beginning and the end were indistinguishable. The floral patterned pot, still enamored with the notion of a moon-shaped biscuit, sighed again. Perhaps biscuits are celestial, stars that fall into saucers, constellations that crumble in our company. The chipped blue pot burbled in agreement. Every crumb is a fragment of the universe, a cosmos scattered across tablecloths. The stout brown pot, however, refused to indulge in such cosmic thinking. A biscuit, it said firmly, is flour, sugar, and effort, nothing more. But the ivory pot, tilting its lid just slightly, responded, and yet people treat them as comfort. That must mean they are more than ingredients. Comfort is not measurable. Comfort is an atmosphere. This observation pleased everyone, even the brown pot, which decided not to grumble further. Silence drifted in then, soft and spacious, as if the biscuits themselves had withdrawn from the conversation. The air smelled faintly of cooling tea, faintly of dust, faintly of an afternoon that was content to remain uneventful. And as the teapots rested, still and filled with their many small thoughts, it seemed almost obvious that biscuits had never really been the subject at all. They were only an excuse for conversation, the way clouds are only an excuse for people to mention the weather. What mattered was not the biscuit, but the talking. And what mattered even less, but in a way that mattered most, was the quiet that followed. If one is to tell the story of teapot opinions, one must begin long before this particular afternoon. long before lace curtains, long before chipped spouts and floral patterns faded by too much sunlight. According to the Teapots, and they were unanimous on this point, the very first opinion in history was not about tea at all, but about spoons. It happened, so the story goes, in a small stone kitchen with uneven floors and a draught that never quite left. A plain clay pot sat cooling by the hearth, its body still warm from the day's work. Next to it lay a spoon, wooden, and slightly singed at the edge. The teapot, not yet aware that it was capable of having opinions, found itself sighing quietly at the spoon. "You," it thought, or perhaps muttered, "are far too smug." The spoon naturally had nothing to say. Spoons rarely do. But the teapot considered this thought significant. It was not an observation about being filled or emptied, nor was it a practical concern about water or heat. It was, quite simply, an opinion. Over the centuries, this first murmured thought about spoons spread quietly among teapots everywhere, passed along in the subtle way of porcelain lore, not written, not spoken aloud to humans, but carried in the faint clinks and sighs of teapots stacked together in cupboards, or left to cool on hearths. By the time centuries had rolled along, centuries in which spoons remained stubbornly smug, the teapots had accepted that opinions were not only possible, but inevitable. And so, in some small way, every opinion voiced on that warm afternoon of lace curtains could trace its lineage back to a single clay pot, irritated by a spoon. And if you listen closely to a teapot today, when it rattles faintly after pouring, you might almost hear that ancient murmur, "smug." The second major milestone in teapot opinion-making was, predictably, about pouring. Once the spoon debate had settled into tradition, teapots began to contemplate their real occupation, the act of being tilted. An old pewter pot was the first to put it plainly. During a particularly long evening, it declared, "Pouring is undignified." This was controversial, not because the statement was untrue, but because it was undeniably true. For what is pouring, really, but being upended? One spends all one's time standing firm, balanced, proud of one's roundness, only to be lifted without warning, tipped forward and forced to spill one's insides into cups. To call it undignified was putting it politely. But other teapots were quick to counter. A porcelain pot with painted lilies remarked, "Yes, but pouring is purpose. Without it, we would merely be jars with fancy spouts." This struck many as a fair point. Thus began the centuries-long debate over whether pouring was humiliation or honor. Each generation of teapots had its say. Clay pots grumbled. Silver pots claimed dignity was inherent in their shine. Glass teapots, transparent as they were, tended to keep out of the argument altogether, their opinions visible but unspoken. In the end, no conclusion was reached, as no conclusion ever is among teapots. But the conversation itself mattered, and perhaps that is why, when you pour tea today, the faint hiss you sometimes hear is not steam at all, but a pot quietly murmuring its position in an ancient debate. And if the pour seems smoother one day than another, perhaps that is not your steady hand but the teapot, conceding that, for the moment, pouring is acceptable. Of course, not all opinions were spoken. Some were stored quietly like tea leaves left to rest at the bottom of a pot. In fact, teapots often prided themselves not on the opinions they shared, but on the opinions they withheld. There was, for instance, the famous silence of the copper pot of Bath, left to sit in a grand townhouse, admired by guests but rarely used. The copper pot never uttered a single word in centuries of service. But teapots still tell stories about it. Its silence was not emptiness, but presence. It was a silence that carried weight, as though it had 1,000 opinions it simply refused to share. Modern teapots, when left cooling on shelves, sometimes mimic this legacy. They will sit for hours, lids closed tight, not a sigh nor a murmur escaping. Humans may believe the pot is simply resting, but other teapots recognize the gesture immediately, the silent, dignified echo of their copper ancestor. And so, when one speaks today of the first opinions, it is never just the spoon remark or the pouring debate. It is also the silences, the withheld thoughts, the pauses that stretched across centuries. For in the world of teapots, to say nothing at all is often the strongest opinion of all. As the afternoon light faded slightly against the lace curtains, the present-day pots on the shelf seemed to hum with this inheritance. They were not just pots with chatter, they were part of a long and noble lineage of muttering, sighing, disagreeing, and occasionally refusing to say a word. And perhaps that was the true comfort of their existence, that every small thought, every trivial sigh, every crumb-related musing, was part of something endless, a heritage of nothing in particular, stretching gently through time. The great near-disagreement of the teapots began, predictably, with milk, not the drinking of it. Teapots never trouble themselves with such finalities, but the order in which it ought to be poured. The ivory pot, polished and refined, declared with unusual crispness, "Milk first is civilized. It tempers the heat, spares the porcelain cup from shock. It is an act of kindness." The stout brown pot disagreed, but in the softest way possible. "Nonsense," it said, though with no venom at all. "Tea first, then milk. Otherwise, how can one judge strength? Pour milk first, and you are flying blind." The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly, not out of agitation but simply because its shelf was uneven. "What does it matter?" it murmured. "When both end up stirred together in the end, the destination is the same." The floral-patterned pot sighed, its lid rattling just slightly. "I like to think milk first is ceremonial, tea first is practical, and both are equally unremarkable once the cup is drunk. Perhaps we are debating nothing." This suggestion, rather than provoking further argument, created a hush. The teapots sat in silence for a long while, as if savoring the possibility that a grand debate might exist without requiring anyone to take sides. And so the disagreement, that wasn't really a disagreement at all, began to dissolve into the very air, faint as steam. The truth is, teapots are constitutionally incapable of quarrel. They may grumble, they may sigh, they may hint at dissent, but genuine conflict never quite takes root. Perhaps it is because their lives are so circular, filled, poured, emptied, waiting, filled again. There is little room for drama in such repetition. The brown pot attempted once, very gently, to escalate. "If you insist on milk first," it rumbled, "then you disregard the brewer's intent." But the ivory pot only tilted its spout gracefully, and replied, "And if you insist on tea first, you disregard the drinker's preference." This exchange might have sharpened into argument among humans. Voices would have risen, words chosen with edges. But teapots are not built for edges. Their curves make them round in thought as well as form. By the time the ivory pot finished speaking, both it and the brown pot seemed to have forgotten what point they were making. The chipped blue pot gave a little burble that sounded suspiciously like amusement. "We are very bad at quarreling," it said. The floral patterned pot gave its customary sigh. "Perhaps that is our greatest strength." And at once the tension, if such a word could ever be used for teapots, dissolved entirely. The disagreement that wasn't lingered only in memory, like the faint trace of warmth after tea has been poured out. No teapot mentioned milk again for the rest of the afternoon, not because the matter had been resolved, but because they had found a way around resolution entirely. This was their method, their way of being, to drift toward contention, then pause politely, then drift away again. Humans might call it avoidance, but to teapots it was simply wisdom. Why strain porcelain over questions that, by their very nature, would never matter? And so they returned to silence, occasionally broken by the soft creak of the shelf or the sigh of the curtain in the breeze. It was a silence that did not feel empty, but pleasantly full of things left unsaid. If one looked at them just then, lined up still, their spouts angled like noses half-turned toward one another, one might almost believe they had come to an agreement after all. Not about milk, not about tea, not about order or tradition, but about the virtue of letting questions steep indefinitely, unanswered and undemanding. And perhaps that is why teapots endure so well across centuries, because they have mastered the art of not deciding, and of finding comfort in the warmth of their own indecision. It began, oddly enough, with nothing at all. The morning sun moved softly through the lace curtains, laying its pale rectangles across the shelf, and yet no teapot stirred. No mutterings, no sighs, no discussions of biscuits, milk, or spoons. It was as though the entire row of them had agreed, without a single word, that today would be silent. The ivory pot, usually quick to comment on the weather, remained perfectly still. The stout brown pot, prone to grumbles about dust, said nothing. Even the floral patterned pot, famous for its long and elaborate sighs, seemed to hold its breath. At first the silence felt unusual, but very quickly it became comfortable. The kind of quiet that grows not from absence, but from presence. A quiet that seems to say, "We could speak, but we are choosing not to." And in that choosing there was a dignity the teapots rarely wore. They sat as though they were wise objects in a gallery, aware of being observed, yet giving nothing away. It was, after all, the kind of day when words would only seem out of place. As the hours passed, the silence took on texture. It was not simply the lack of chatter. It became its own presence, wrapping around the shelf and filling the room in slow waves. The chipped blue pot discovered that it rather liked being quiet. Its uneven wobble seemed less obvious when it made no sound. The floral patterned pot noticed the sun glinting off its glaze and thought, silently, that perhaps it was prettier when it wasn't speaking. The stout brown pot found, to its surprise, that the absence of words was restful, as though its very roundness had expanded into the silence itself. Every small creak of the wood, every flutter of the curtain, every tick of the distant clock grew louder in the hush. The room was no longer background, it was foreground. The air itself seemed to lean in, listening to the quiet as though it were a conversation in its own right. And perhaps it was. Perhaps silence is simply another kind of speech, one that carries more weight than all the muttered debates about spoons and milk combined. By afternoon, the silence had grown so natural that it was hard to remember a time when the teapots had spoken at all. The ivory pot, tilting just slightly as though nodding to itself, thought, but did not say that silence suited them. The floral patterned pot almost sighed but caught itself at the last moment, savoring the satisfaction of restraint. The brown pot sat proudly in its stillness, as though the quiet were its personal idea all along. When the light shifted and the room dimmed, no one broke the hush. It remained whole, uncracked, like a perfect glaze without a single flaw. Only when evening came and shadows lengthened across the shelf did the chipped blue pot give a faint little clink. Not a word, not even a sound meant to be heard, just a reminder perhaps that silence had been kept, and that it could be lifted whenever they wished. And yet no one did, for sometimes the best opinion is not to voice one at all, but to let the quiet linger, steeping in its own invisible way. If there was any conclusion to that day, it was this: that silence itself can be an event, a moment worth remembering, a kind of eloquence without utterance. And so the Teapots, without quite deciding it, added silence to their long list of opinions. The event was subtle at first: a faint scrape, a shift of porcelain against wood, and then the sugar bowl appeared. It was not new, not exactly. It had always been in the room, resting on the table where spoons clinked and tea cooled, but today it had been set on the shelf, among the teapots, among those who, until now, had considered themselves a closed circle. The sugar bowl was round and cheerful, with a lid that rattled faintly whenever it moved. It carried the faint scent of sweetness that lingered in its corners, and though it was technically a vessel like the teapots, it had none of their solemnity. "Good afternoon," it said brightly, without waiting to be acknowledged. "What a cozy spot you all have up here." The teapots did not answer right away, not out of rudeness but out of surprise. Visitors were rare, and visitors who spoke so freely were rarer still. Finally, the floral patterned pot exhaled its slow sigh and said, "Welcome." And just like that, the sugar bowl was part of the shelf. The sugar bowl, however, was not content to sit silently. It chattered. It spoke of teaspoons, of grains and clumps, of being stirred and dissolved. It reminisced about the sound of cubes dropping into cups. It wondered aloud whether sweetness was overrated, then immediately contradicted itself by insisting that life without sugar was unimaginable. The teapots listened politely. They were accustomed to long conversations that went nowhere, but the sugar bowl's energy was of a different sort. Where teapots mulled, the sugar bowl sparkled. Where teapots sighed, the sugar bowl rattled its lid with enthusiasm. The stout brown pot found it mildly exhausting. "Do you ever rest?" it asked. "Oh, constantly," said the sugar bowl cheerfully. "But even when I rest, I'm sweet." The ivory pot tilted its spout in what might have been amusement. The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly and decided, against its own better judgment, that it rather liked the visitor. And so, for the first time in years, the rhythm of the shelf was changed, not broken, not lost, but sprinkled, like sugar, into something a little less predictable. As evening crept in, the sugar bowl's chatter slowed. Perhaps sweetness, too, has limits. Its lid rested softly, and the faint smell of sugar drifted like a memory. The teapots looked upon their guest and found themselves reflecting, not on sugar exactly, but on the notion of difference. For so long they had been a chorus of sameness, round, spouted, steady in their routines. The sugar bowl was none of these things, and yet it fit. Not by blending in, but by remaining unapologetically itself. The floral patterned pot sighed, but this time the sigh sounded almost fond. The stout brown pot admitted silently that variety was not as disruptive as it had feared. The ivory pot considered the elegance of sweetness, and the chipped blue pot, with its wobble, felt strangely reassured by the sugar bowl's cheerful imperfections. The shelf, it seemed, had not been disturbed at all, it had been widened. And so, as the last of the daylight slipped through the lace, the teapots and their visitor sat together in a silence that was not empty but gently full of sweetness, a silence that carried the faint aftertaste of sugar. Of all the features that make a teapot what it is, the handle is the least celebrated. Spouts get all the attention. Their curve, their angle, their ability, or inability, to pour gracefully. Lids enjoy a kind of authority, keeping all that warmth safely in place, rattling proudly at the first sign of steam. Even the body of a pot has admirers, praised for roundness, elegance, or durability. But handles are simply there, taken for granted. The sugar bowl, still new to the shelf, was the one who first raised the subject. "At least you all have handles," it said with a faint rattle. "I must be grasped from both sides like a jar, undignified really." This observation sparked something unexpected. The ivory pot, after a long pause, replied, "Handles are not ornaments, they are obligations." The floral patterned pot sighed, as it so often did, but this time the sigh was long, thoughtful, as though the very air passing through its spout was considering the matter. "We are lifted by our handles, yes," it said. "But do we ever stop to wonder how strange it is to be known not for what we hold, but for how we are held?" The stout brown pot gave a slow, rumbling noise. "A handle is nothing but a loop, and yet without it, we are incomplete. People fear hot surfaces, so they cling to our handles as though we'd betray them otherwise." The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly, uncertain. "Perhaps a handle is like a promise," it ventured. "We don't need to speak it. It's simply understood. I will be held, and I will not scold you." The room fell into a hush. Even the sugar bowl seemed subdued by the idea, a forgotten limb, suddenly revealed as the quiet philosophy of every pot. And so the teapots sat a little taller on their shelf, each one suddenly aware of its own handle, as though it had been carrying a truth all along without knowing. By midday the discussion had deepened. Handles, once ignored, now loomed in the minds of every vessel on the shelf. The ivory pot declared, with the authority of fine porcelain, "A handle is a form of control. We are grasped, tilted, emptied, all because of it. It is the instrument of our undoing." The stout brown pot disagreed, but softly. "No, a handle is freedom. Without it, we would be left untouched, admired perhaps, but never used. A pot unused is no pot at all. It is only a hollow ornament." The floral patterned pot, caught between the two, sighed so long that the sugar bowl rattled its lid in impatience. "Must everything be a paradox?" the sugar bowl asked. "Handles can be both burden and blessing. Isn't that the obvious answer?" The chipped blue pot, however, was not convinced. It wobbled gently and murmured, "Perhaps the handle is neither. Perhaps it is only what it is, a loop of clay, attached without asking, neither proud nor ashamed. It is people who make it more than that. We are blamed or praised for how they choose to hold us." This thought sank heavily into the shelf, as though the very wood beneath them absorbed it. For there was something undeniably true about it. Handles did not choose their shape. They were molded, attached, expected to endure. All the philosophy in the world could not change the fact that a handle simply was. Yet the conversation continued, circling round and round like a handle itself, endless, looping, never reaching an end. And in that looping, the teapots found comfort. Evening drew closer, and the light through the lace curtains softened into the color of warm honey. Still, the teapots lingered on the subject, unwilling to let the matter of handles slip into silence. The ivory pot grew reflective. Perhaps the handle is not for us at all. Perhaps it is for them. We carry tea, but the handle carries the person who carries us. The floral patterned pot released a soft sigh, though this one felt more like a lullaby. Yes, a loop that connects two worlds, the hot and the cool, the full and the empty, the vessel and the hand. A bridge, disguised as an ear. The stout brown pot chuckled faintly. An ear indeed. A handle listens, silently, to every hand that has held it. Imagine the stories stored in such silence. The chipped blue pot tilted ever so slightly, its wobble catching the last of the light. Perhaps that is why we never quarrel too long. We already carry enough. Handles bear not only our weight but the hands of others. That is burden enough. The sugar bowl, uncharacteristically quiet, rattled its lid once in agreement. And then, at last, the shelf fell silent. Not because the conversation was over, but because it had circled back into itself, as all good teapot philosophies do. A loop without end, like the shape of a handle, endlessly curving, endlessly returning. And in that silence, there was a kind of peace, a recognition that some questions are not meant to be answered, only held. It began, as naps often do, not with sleep itself but with the suggestion of it. The floral patterned pot, whose sighs had already been mistaken for yawns many times, let out an especially long exhale. "Ah," it murmured, "the light feels heavy today." The chipped blue pot wobbled gently, not from any external push, but from that soft sway that comes with drowsiness. "Yes," it said. "I feel tilted inside, as though my tea is dreaming before I am." The stout brown pot grumbled, but only half-heartedly. Afternoon has a way of weighing us down. One moment you are upright and purposeful, the next you are dozing, lids rattling in your sleep. Even the ivory pot, usually crisp and upright, allowed its handle to lean ever so slightly against the floral patterned pot beside it, as though sharing in the weight of the moment. The sugar bowl rattled faintly in protest. "But surely it's too early for rest," it chirped. Yet even as it said so, a small hush seemed to fall over its own lid, as though a yawn had crept into it unnoticed. And so, without planning, without ceremony, the shelf began to sink into the first stages of afternoon slumber. Silence deepened, not abruptly, but like tea steeping slowly, turning richer by degrees. The floral patterned pot tilted its spout downward just slightly, like a chin nodding forward in sleep. The chipped blue pot, wobbling faintly, found itself oddly stable now that it was too drowsy to wobble much at all. The stout brown pot made a sound that might have been a snore, though it insisted later it was only settling against the wood. The ivory pot dreamed upright, dignified even in rest, though if one looked closely one might have seen a faint flicker of glaze catching the sunlight like a half-closed eyelid. The sugar bowl, whose energy had seemed boundless only hours before, discovered something new. That sweetness itself could nap. its lid fell still. The faint perfume of sugar hung in the air like a dream that had drifted out and stayed behind. The whole shelf, once full of chatter, now hummed with a kind of restful stillness, not empty, not silent in the way silence had been before, but softened, cushioned, like a teapot, filled not with tea, but with warm clouds. And in that hush the afternoon seemed to pause outside the window as well, the lace curtains barely moving, as though the entire room had chosen to nap in solidarity. Sleep, when it came, was not quite sleep. Teapots do not dream as humans do. Instead, they steep in memory. The floral patterned pot drifted through images of endless gardens, flowers painted on its glaze opening and closing in slow, impossible rhythms. The chipped blue pot dreamed of wobbling, except this time, its wobble carried it across oceans, its handle like a sail, its spout pointing toward distant horizons. The stout brown pot dreamed of warmth, of firesides, of kitchens, of countless hands wrapped around cups. In its dream it was not emptied, but always full, heavy with purpose, round with contentment. The ivory pot dreamed of reflection, of light on its surface, of itself mirrored in the polished silver spoons it once accompanied, of stillness so complete that the entire world seemed made only of porcelain and polish. Even the sugar bowl dreamed or steeped in sweetness. In its dream it was endless, inexhaustible, every grain a tiny star dissolving into the universe. And while they dreamed, the shelf itself seemed to lean back, creak gently, and join them, a nap not of objects, nor even of time, but of atmosphere itself. When the teapots finally stirred, lids rattling faintly, spouts lifting like noses sniffing the air, it was unclear how much time had passed. An hour? A moment? A whole afternoon? It didn't matter. The nap had left behind something better than time. A faint aftertaste of rest. And as they returned slowly to wakefulness, the teapots understood, without needing to say it, that naps are less about sleeping, and more about allowing the world to be soft for a while. If the handle is the limb no one praises, then the lid is the crown no one questions. Perched atop every teapot, it is rarely admired yet always assumed to be essential. Humans hardly notice it unless it rattles or goes missing. But to teapots, lids are their very sentinels. The ivory pot was the first to raise the subject that afternoon. Without a lid we are incomplete, vulnerable, spilled into too easily. The stout brown pot gave a slow rumble. Or liberating. I once knew a pot that lost its lid. Said it felt lighter, freer. No one expected it to keep secrets anymore. The floral patterned pot sighed, long and delicate. Yes, but secrecy is the dignity of tea. Without a lid, warmth escapes, thoughts escape, the moment itself escapes. The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly, uncertain as always. Perhaps the lid is not a crown, nor a guard, nor a burden. Perhaps it is simply a polite reminder that what is inside is not yet ready to be poured. The sugar bowl rattled cheerfully. I have a lid too. Mine hides sweetness, yours hides steeping. We are all gatekeepers, of one sort or another. And so the shelf considered, quietly, the role of the lid, not just a cover, but a philosophy, that some things are best kept within until the right moment comes to share them. As the light shifted, one of the lids gave a faint metallic tremor, as though punctuating the conversation. Lids, after all, cannot help themselves. They rattle. They announce. The ivory pot, proud as ever, declared, "That is the sound of patience. A lid rattles to remind us that waiting is necessary." The tea is not ready, the thought is not ready, the moment is not ready. The stout brown pot disagreed gently. No, it is the sound of protest. The lid wishes to be lifted, to release what has been held too long. Every rattle is a plea for air. The floral patterned pot sighed so softly that the sound seemed almost part of the rattle itself. Perhaps it is both, a patience that grows restless, a reminder that even stillness wishes, eventually, to move. The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly and whispered. Or perhaps lids rattle for no reason at all. Not every sound needs meaning. Sometimes porcelain and steam simply collide, and we imagine philosophy where there is only physics. The sugar bowl rattled its own lid in cheerful solidarity. I like to think every rattle is laughter, but perhaps I am biased. This suggestion made the shelf pause in silence, each pot quietly wondering whether they had been interpreting lids all wrong. Perhaps all along lids had simply been laughing. As evening drew nearer, the philosophy of lids reached a soft, inevitable stillness. The ivory pot remained convinced of dignity, the stout brown pot insisted on freedom, the floral patterned pot sighed at the paradox. The chipped blue pot wobbled into uncertainty. The sugar bowl rattled with delight. And yet, together, they had built something more important than agreement. They had built an atmosphere. The lace curtains stirred. The sunlight thinned. The shelf seemed to lean into itself, warm and satisfied. The teapots, each with their lids resting quietly in place, realized that lids were more than crowns, more than guards, more than rattles. They were punctuation, the final mark that closes a thought, seals a moment, contains a day. And so as the room slipped into shadow, the teapots sat together with their lids firmly settled, keeping warmth within, holding back the world until morning. If handles were loops and bodies were vessels, then lids were endings, and endings after all are only another form of rest. Evening never arrives suddenly on a shelf. It creeps in slowly, like tea darkening by degrees. The lace curtains, once bright with daylight, grew dim, filtering the sun into strips of muted gold. The teapots noticed, not with alarm, but with the slow recognition of those who have seen many evenings before. The floral patterned pot sighed, softer than usual, as though conserving energy. The day lengthens and we grow shorter, it murmured. The stout brown pot gave a low, steady rumble. Not shorter, just quieter. Evening does not take from us, it hushes us. The ivory pot, polished and dignified, tilted its spout in agreement. Evening is a kind of pause, not an end, like the comma before a sentence takes its breath. The chipped blue pot wobbled faintly, catching the play of shadow across its glaze. Then perhaps we are commas too, waiting in the text of the day, holding the space between what has been and what has yet to come. The sugar bowl rattled its lid softly, as if to laugh at such solemnity. Or perhaps evening is simply what happens when the sun grows tired. Why complicate it? But no one argued. For in the stretch of shadows, every thought seemed less like philosophy, and more like a sigh. At last, a lamp was lit in the room. Its glow fell warm and circular, catching the edges of porcelain and glass in soft halos. The floral patterned pot admired how its painted blossoms glowed faintly in the artificial light. Evening makes us reflective, it said, but lamplight makes us visible again. A small kindness. The stout brown pot shifted faintly, proud of the way its glaze shone under the golden hue. There is strength in lamplight, it makes old clay look sturdy again. The ivory pot, ever the philosopher mused. Lamplight is not sunlight, but neither is it darkness. It is the in-between. Perhaps that is why evening feels long. It stretches us between two worlds. The chipped blue pot, wobbling faintly, found comfort in the glow. I like lamplight best, it confessed. It hides my chips, it makes me look whole again. Even the sugar bowl, usually quick with chatter, grew quiet, its lid barely stirring. The lamp makes us companions, it whispered. Not decorations, not relics, just companions sitting together, warm and waiting. And in that moment the shelf felt almost like a table, and the table almost like a hearth, and the hearth almost like a home. The evening grew longer, stretching like cool tea across an untouched cup. The lamp hummed faintly, the curtains hung still, and the teapots seemed to exhale together, though none made a sound. The floral patterned pot let its painted blossoms fade back into shadow, content with their brief glow. The stout brown pot grew heavier, as though evening itself had settled into its clay. The ivory pot stood tall, its lid resting like a crown, proud even in the hush. The chipped blue pot leaned slightly toward its companions, steady in its wobble for once. The sugar bowl remained perfectly quiet, a rare occurrence, but not an unwelcome one. Its silence was sweet, a final offering for the day. Night had not yet fully arrived, but the patience of it filled the room. A waiting that was not restless, but calm. A waiting that asked for nothing more than to sit, and breathe, and be. And so the shelf entered its long evening, not hurried, not dramatic, simply stretched across time like a soft cloth, holding them all together in stillness. If the day was chatter, and the nap was pause, then the evening was neither. It was the space where nothing was required, where teapots could simply exist, glazed vessels of thought, resting in the patience of night. Night, when it came, did not announce itself with fanfare. It simply settled, a soft and thorough settling, as though a blanket had been pulled across the shelf. The curtains no longer glowed, they were simply there. The lamp's circle of light narrowed to a dim halo, enough to remind the teapots that they existed, but not enough to keep them awake. The floral patterned pot sighed, though even the sigh was drowsy, a mere breath of porcelain. This, it murmured, is the hour of almost sleeping, almost dreaming, almost forgetting. The stout brown pot rumbled faintly, a sound that felt more like a snore than a statement. Dreams, it said, are not for teapots. We hold tea, not visions. But the ivory pot disagreed, as it always did, though even its disagreement was softened by sleepiness. Dreams, it insisted, belong to anyone who has been filled, and emptied, and filled again. Even vessels remember. Perhaps dreams are simply memories rearranged. The chipped blue pot wobbled once, then stilled. If we dream, it whispered, I hope it is not of biscuits. We have discussed them enough already. The sugar bowl rattled its lid faintly, as though chuckling in its sleep, and then even the chuckle faded, leaving only the hush of the long night. Time in the night did not move the way it did in the day. It loosened, unraveled, wandered like steam drifting into air. The floral patterned pot dreamed of its blossoms stretching across endless fields, far beyond porcelain, swaying in wind it could not feel. The stout brown pot dreamed of warmth, of endless cups poured, of weight in its sturdy clay, of usefulness that never grew heavy. The ivory pot dreamed inevitably of philosophy. In its dream, lids discussed crowns with handles, spouts debated with saucers, and nothing was resolved, but everything was very dignified. The chipped blue pot dreamed of balance, of standing steady without wobble, of being whole without needing lamplight to disguise its cracks. And the sugar bowl, of course, dreamed of sweetness, but in its dream sugar was not granules but light, scattering across everything until the whole shelf glowed. These dreams did not disturb their rest. They were not loud or vivid. They were quiet extensions of what the teapots already were. Their shapes made into stories, their stillness turned into motion. The room grew darker still, until even the lamp was gone. The shelf disappeared into shadow, leaving the teapots to themselves. There was no chatter, no rattle, no sigh, only the soft presence of resting objects held together by the hush of night. If anyone had looked into the room, they might have thought the shelf empty, so complete was the quiet. But within that quiet, the teapots dreamed their small dreams, each in its own way, and together they formed a harmony of stillness. The floral patterned pot with its fields, the stout brown pot with its warmth, the ivory pot with its dignified debates, the chipped blue pot with its balance, the sugar bowl with its glow, all of them drifted in their gentle nonsense, their little philosophies, their perfectly ordinary existence. And as the night deepened, the dreams softened, and even the act of dreaming seemed too much effort. What remained was only rest. So the shelf passed into sleep, unremarkable, uneventful, exactly as a shelf should, and in that unremarkableness was a kind of quiet perfection. And so, that was the day, a day in which nothing much happened, except of course that everything did. Teapots sighed, lids rattled, biscuits were overanalyzed, and the evening stretched on as only evenings can. You may not remember every pot's opinion, or even care to, but that's rather the point. Their little musings were not meant to be carried away, only to pass the time, until passing time no longer mattered. So let the shelf fade, let the room dim, and let the voices of porcelain drift off like steam into air. The teapots are resting now, and so perhaps should you. After all, a night is just a lid placed gently over the day. Good night.